What if I told you that the chosen people who carried the promise through centuries of exile and covenant could not see the Messiah standing in front of them? And what if I revealed that this blindness was not a simple refusal, but part of a deeper pattern woven into the soul of humanity itself? I have walked through the records of spirit, and I have seen how expectation becomes a veil covering the eyes of a nation, and how that veil was heavy upon Israel when Jesus came among them. This is not only a story of history, it is a living current that still shapes the faith of millions today. Imagine the prophets crying out across the ages, Isaiah speaking of a servant who would bear grief, Jeremiah foretelling a covenant written not on stone but on the heart, Daniel seeing visions of an anointed one cut off. These voices echoed through generations of suffering and hope. Yet when the time arrived, the form of the Messiah did not match the picture drawn in the minds of the people. They sought a king who would shatter Roman chains, but instead they met a teacher who said, "Forgive your enemies." They desired a throne in Jerusalem, but he spoke of a kingdom not of this world. They wanted a sword, he carried only a cross, and so they turned away. It is here that I sense the deepest paradox. The covenant people, bound by law and tradition, were prepared for glory, but not for humility, for conquest, but not for surrender, for victory in battle, but not for victory over death through sacrifice. As I gaze into the soul records, I see that rejection is never the end. It is a stage in awakening. The Jewish people were not abandoned by God. Their refusal became the opening for Gentiles to enter the covenant, a mystery hidden yet revealed by the Apostle Paul, who spoke of branches broken off that others might be grafted in. And yet he also saw a future when the hardened heart would soften and all Israel would recognize the one they pierced. Many ask why a people so steeped in prophecy could not accept the fulfillment before their eyes. The answer lies in the weight of history and the shaping power of expectation. When the body is weary from oppression, the soul clings to images of rescue that seem most logical: armies, banners, a throne restored. It is difficult to accept that deliverance may come clothed in weakness, that the eternal would dwell in flesh and blood and eat with tax collectors and sinners. But this difficulty is the very crucible of faith. For faith is not seeing what matches desire, it is perceiving what transcends it. The rejection was painful, yet it served a purpose. And in this I find a lesson for every soul, for we all carry images of how salvation should appear, and when life presents us with a different form, we are tempted to turn away. Many still ask, does it make sense for Gentiles to embrace what Israel resisted? The records show that it is not a contradiction, but a widening of the promise. God's covenant was never meant to remain within one boundary. It was seed destined to spread across nations and tongues. The Gentiles heard and believed because the Spirit moved beyond borders, while Israel guarded tradition and identity. Yet even in that guarding there is fidelity, for by clinging to the oneness of God, they preserved a truth that the nations would also need to remember. So the paradox is not a failure, but a balance between revelation and protection, and through time both will be reconciled. When I reflect on this mystery, I hear again the words of Jesus. Before Abraham was, I am, he declared, a claim that shattered boundaries of thought. And for those bound by Shema, the Lord is one, it seemed impossible to accept. Yet in the Spirit records the meaning is clear. Divinity cloaked itself in humility so that humanity could be lifted into communion, and such a mystery cannot be grasped without the breaking of old images. Therefore, the rejection becomes part of the story, not its end. And for you who listen today, this is not a tale of ancient stubbornness, it is a mirror of the human condition. How often do you miss the divine because it does not appear as you expected? How often do you seek liberation in outward change when the greater freedom is within? The story of Israel and Jesus is the story of every soul. For each of us must decide whether to cling to the familiar image or to recognize the Messiah when he comes in forms we do not imagine. And so I tell you, the rejection itself was foreseen. It was written into the tapestry of redemption so that no nation, no soul would be left outside the reach of grace. The covenant that shaped Israel was not built on accident or whim. It was born in the call of Abraham, who left homeland and kin to follow a voice that spoke from eternity, and from that obedience a people emerged with a destiny unlike any other, marked not for privilege, but for the burden of carrying divine truth in a world of false gods. And as I look into the soul records, I see how every law and ritual was more than external rule. It was a vibration intended to align human life with divine order, a pattern to keep the mind centered and the heart pure, so that the presence of God would not be forgotten amidst the clamor of nations. And yet with every covenant comes weight, for identity rooted in sacred calling can easily harden into pride, and purpose given for service can become shield for separation. And this duality is written across the centuries of Israel's journey, a nation called to be a light, yet often stumbling in shadows. The Exodus under Moses sealed this calling with fire and command. Sinai thundered, and the people trembled as laws were given not merely to regulate but to embody holiness itself. Sabbath, rest, dietary restrictions, purity codes. Each act carried symbolic resonance. Each commandment was like a chord in a symphony, reminding them of their chosen state. And while other nations bowed to idols, Israel was to stand apart. But what sets apart can also isolate, and what protects identity can also entrap it when the form is mistaken for the essence. And thus, generation after generation, the people clung to form while waiting for fulfillment, eyes set on prophecies of deliverance. I see how this waiting shaped the collective soul. Every festival, every psalm, every sacrifice carried a hidden question: when will the promised one come? And as empires rose and fell over them, Assyria, Babylon, Greece, Rome, the expectation crystallized into a dream of a king who would reverse humiliation, who would restore sovereignty, who would vindicate centuries of suffering. And in that dream, the heart of prophecy narrowed from universal healing to national victory, from spiritual renewal to political power. Yet within the scriptures, the dual current remained. Isaiah spoke of the suffering servant who would bear iniquities. Zechariah foresaw the pierced one who would be mourned. Daniel envisioned an anointed cut off, and alongside these stood visions of a triumphant ruler from the line of David, a shepherd king who would establish justice and peace. And so the collective expectation became divided. Some awaited conquest, others hoped for restoration through righteousness, and the tension between these visions lay unresolved when Jesus appeared. In the records of the soul, I see that identity is not only what you inherit, but also what blinds you. The Jews were bound by covenant to be guardians of divine truth, but in guarding, they built walls around the promise, and when the promise itself came in unexpected form, they could not see it, for expectation had turned into filter, and filter into barrier. And this is not a judgment upon them alone, but a pattern of the human soul. For each of us clings to images of salvation fashioned by need and pain, and when the real answer comes, we may resist because it does not match what we imagined. Israel was trained by covenant to be holy, but holiness interpreted through centuries of oppression became a longing for vindication. And when the Messiah came speaking not of swords, but of hearts transformed, not of overthrow, but of forgiveness, the message struck against the hardened layers of expectation. And thus rejection was born not out of ignorance, but out of conflict between identity and revelation, between what was promised and how the people assumed it must appear. Still, the covenant itself was not broken. The bond of God with Israel remained, for the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. And in this lies the mystery that Paul later revealed. The rejection was not final, but a step within divine design, opening the way for Gentiles to share in the promise while Israel preserved the testimony of God's oneness. As I read the flow of spirit, I know this tension is purposeful, for truth reveals itself in stages, first to a people bound by covenant, then to nations once far away, and finally to all in unity. And this unfolding cannot be rushed, for each stage is necessary to prepare the soul of humanity to receive fullness. Thus, the covenant with Abraham is still alive, not as history, but as spiritual foundation, a witness to every soul that faith requires leaving what is known, that holiness is a path of responsibility, and that expectation must always yield to revelation. The prophets did not speak in vain. Their visions became the lifeblood of a people longing for deliverance. And in the soul records I see how each word, each oracle, carried both light and weight. For prophecy is never simply prediction, it is mirror and seed, showing what is to come but also shaping what is expected. And thus the Jewish people came to carry inside themselves a dual image of the Messiah, one as the suffering servant who would bear grief and redeem through pain, and another as the conquering king who would restore the throne of David and bring justice upon oppressors. And when centuries of exile and domination pressed upon their backs, the second image grew stronger, fed by pain and national humiliation, until it overshadowed the first, so that when the Messiah appeared in humility, they could not perceive him because the image in their hearts had hardened into certainty. Isaiah spoke of one despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and yet the people looked for a warrior. Jeremiah promised a covenant written upon the heart, but the people awaited political renewal. Daniel foresaw an anointed one cut off, but expectation turned it into vision of a ruler preserved and victorious, and thus prophecy was interpreted through the lens of suffering, narrowed by longing for liberation from Rome, for dignity restored in the land, for sovereignty reclaimed, and in that narrowing the deeper meaning was veiled. I know from the records of souls that expectation can be both guide and prison, for it draws the mind toward a goal, yet blinds it to other possibilities. And the Jewish people, chosen as stewards of divine revelation, carried an expectation so fervent it became an idol, a golden image of a king draped in military might, while the true Messiah came robed in compassion, healing the sick, lifting the poor, forgiving sins, speaking of a kingdom that is within. And because he did not match their image, they turned away, though his words fulfilled the very prophecies they recited in synagogues. Consider the weight of Roman occupation, taxes crushing the poor, soldiers patrolling streets, priests negotiating fragile peace with governors who cared nothing for their covenant. In such conditions, who would not cry out for a liberator with sword in hand, who would not long for vengeance upon oppressors? And yet the Messiah spoke of loving enemies, of turning the other cheek, of carrying burdens twice as far. And for many this was not liberation, but disappointment, not salvation, but insult, and thus rejection became inevitable. For the Messiah did not fail them. Rather, they could not see beyond the narrow hope shaped by their suffering. In my vision, I understand that suffering is both teacher and deceiver. It awakens longing for God, but also tempts the soul to confine deliverance to the form most desired. And so Israel, yearning for victory, misread the voice of prophecy, clinging to the promise of glory while overlooking the path of sacrifice. And when Jesus stood before them as fulfillment of both streams, servant and king, they could not reconcile the paradox. And so the nation divided, some receiving him with joy, others denouncing him as blasphemer and threat. This division itself was foreseen, for truth, when revealed, always divides before it unites. And the Messiah's presence forced every soul to decide whether to cling to expectation or to open to revelation. And that choice is still before each of us, for even today many seek salvation only in outer change, in power, in signs of worldly triumph, while the true kingdom is still within, hidden until the heart surrenders. The prophets gave glimpses, not blueprints, and their visions remain alive for those who read with spirit rather than fear. Isaiah's servant points to the mystery of redemption through suffering, Jeremiah's covenant whispers of inward transformation, Daniel's anointed one reveals the pattern of sacrifice, and David's promise of a throne, eternal, speaks of a reign not limited to geography but extending to eternity. And yet the people of the first century saw these strands as contradiction rather than complement, choosing one image while discarding the other. And so when the Messiah embodied both, they could not bear it. In the records of spirit, I see how the divine plan allows such blindness, not as punishment, but as preparation. For rejection opened the door to Gentiles, spreading the covenant beyond Israel, and in time Israel too will see with new eyes, recognizing that the servant and the king are one, that the cross was the throne, and that the pierced one was the fulfillment of every promise. This is the mystery of prophecy. It cannot be grasped in the moment of its utterance. It unfolds across generations, and its meaning is hidden until the appointed time, so that faith is required not only to wait but to discern. And the lesson of Israel's longing is the lesson of every soul. Be careful that your expectation does not blind you to revelation, for deliverance rarely comes in the form you imagine. It comes in the form your spirit truly needs, and often that form is humility, suffering, and love. Jesus entered into the midst of Israel with words that pierced deeper than politics, proclaiming a kingdom not of this world. And as I search the records of the soul, I see how his message of inner transformation unsettled a people yearning for outer liberation, for they longed for a liberator who would shatter Roman power with sword and banner. Yet he spoke of forgiveness, of loving enemies, of a kingdom that begins in the heart rather than in the throne room of Jerusalem. And this collision between expectation and revelation became the heart of the rejection. For the Messiah stood before them, yet did not fit the mold they had forged through centuries of suffering, and so they dismissed what their eyes beheld. He healed the blind, raised the dead, fed the hungry, and yet the leaders ask for signs, not because they lacked evidence, but because the signs he offered did not align with the signs they demanded, for they desired conquest, and he offered compassion. They wanted Rome overthrown, and he spoke of overcoming sin. They dreamed of freedom from taxes, while he said, "Render to Caesar what is Caesar's." And so the people felt disillusioned, thinking perhaps this man was no Messiah at all, but a distraction from the liberation they sought. And yet in truth he was the fulfillment of every prophecy, only not in the way they imagined. I have seen in the Akashic records that when truth comes to the soul, it rarely comes in the form the mind expects. It arrives wrapped in humility. It arrives disguised in simplicity. And so it was with Jesus, who came not in royal robes, but in the garment of a carpenter, not in palaces, but in fields and villages, not with armies, but with fishermen. And this inversion of expectation was too great for many to accept, for to believe him they would have to surrender their dream of vengeance and embrace a dream of mercy. They would have to exchange desire for domination with a call to servanthood, and for many this was unbearable. The kingdom he preached was radical. It demanded not the overthrow of Rome, but the overthrow of pride, not the destruction of enemies, but the destruction of hatred, not a restoration of Israel's political glory, but a restoration of humanity's union with God. And though this was the higher truth to the people of his day, it seemed weakness, for in their pain they could not see that the greater chains were not the shackles of Rome, but the bondage of sin and fear. And when he said, "Blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness," the words fell like fire upon dry grass, igniting hope in the poor, yet offending the powerful. As I trace this moment, I see that rejection is not only historical, but universal. For each soul desires God to act according to its own need. When God appears in another form, the soul resists. And so Israel resisted because the kingdom Jesus proclaimed did not mirror their longing. And yet in that resistance, the larger plan unfolded, for the rejection became the very path through which salvation extended beyond Israel to every nation, so that what seemed failure was in truth expansion. What looked like defeat was in truth victory. Still, the pain of rejection was real, and Jesus himself wept over Jerusalem, saying, "How often I longed to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks, but you would not." And in that lament I hear the eternal sorrow of God, who offers light only to be turned away by those waiting for another kind of light. And yet this sorrow does not end in bitterness, for the plan of redemption moves even through refusal. From the soul's perspective, I see that Jesus in his humility revealed the true nature of power, that to conquer through violence is temporary, but to conquer through love is eternal, that to raise a nation's throne may last for a season, but to raise a soul into union with God endures forever. And so his message, though rejected by many, still found soil in the hearts of those willing to see, and through them the kingdom spread, first in weakness, then in strength, until it reached even to the ends of the earth. The rejection of Jesus by many of his own was not because he failed to fulfill prophecy, but because he fulfilled it in a way too profound for their imagination. For prophecy speaks in symbols and mystery, and they interpret it through pain rather than through spirit. And so the Messiah who came with peace appeared to them as no Messiah at all. And yet through this mystery the divine plan was accomplished, showing that the kingdom of God is never bound to human expectation, It is revealed only to those who are willing to look beyond the veil and recognize truth, even when it comes in the form they least desire. The clash between Jesus and the religious authorities was not a minor disagreement over customs. It was a direct confrontation between a living revelation and a structure built over centuries. And as I look into the records of the soul, I see how the leaders of that age feared him not only because he challenged their teachings, but because he threatened the delicate balance of survival under Roman rule. For the Pharisees and Sadducees had woven a system of oral tradition and ritual designed to protect identity, to guard holiness, to maintain peace with Rome. Yet Jesus exposed the heart of the law as greater than its letter, and in doing so, he unmasked their dependence on power and control, which for them meant stability, but for him meant bondage. When he healed on the Sabbath, they saw violation. When he forgave sins, they heard blasphemy. When he declared before Abraham was I am, they felt the foundations of their doctrine quake, for his claim pierced through the very fabric of monotheism as they understood it, revealing a vision of God dwelling among men. And such a claim demanded either total faith or total rejection, and most chose rejection because faith would cost them everything. These leaders were not merely stubborn men, they were guardians of a fragile nation. They feared that if his movement spread, Rome would crush them, their temple destroyed, their authority stripped, their people scattered, and so Caiaphas said, "It is better that one man die than the whole nation perish." A statement that shows how fear often disguises itself as wisdom. Yet in the soul records I see that this calculation, though made in fear, served the greater design of redemption, for through his death the salvation of many would be revealed. The common people were caught between awe at his miracles and fear of their rulers. Some followed with faith, others hesitated. But the authorities viewed him as destabilizing force, one who might ignite rebellion without carrying a sword, for his words stirred hearts in ways their laws could not, and that kind of influence could not be controlled. To them he was not Messiah, but threat, not deliverer, but danger. For if Rome reacted against unrest, it would be the Sanhedrin who bore the blame, and their own positions of privilege would collapse. In truth, this was not simply politics. It was the clash of two kingdoms, one built on law and compromise, the other on spirit and truth. And whenever such kingdoms meet, conflict is inevitable. I know that in every age, prophets are resisted most fiercely by those who claim to defend God, for institutions harden over time. And when living truth arises, it shakes the ground they stand upon. And so it was with Jesus, whose very presence unmasked the fragility of their authority, whose compassion for sinners undermined their control through fear, whose teaching on inner purity broke their obsession with ritual, and so they sought to silence him, not because they could prove him wrong, but because they could not endure what his truth revealed about themselves. The rejection of Jesus by the leaders was more than theological disagreement. It was the defense of power, and this has repeated in every generation where truth confronts structures, for the soul clings to security and fears change, and institutions are but magnified expressions of this same impulse. Yet what men rejected, God used, for the crucifixion they arranged, became the very act through which salvation was opened. The stone they cast aside became the cornerstone, and in this pattern I see that divine purpose weaves even human resistance into its design. Still, the tragedy remains, for they could not see that the one they condemned was the fulfillment of their own scriptures, that his words were not abolishing the law but fulfilling it, that his miracles were not magic but signs of the kingdom, and that his claim to divinity was not arrogance but incarnation, God dwelling in humility to lift humanity into communion. Their fear blinded them, their authority chained them, their compromise with Rome hardened them, and so they missed the moment of visitation. In this I find a warning for every soul. Beware the impulse to cling so tightly to tradition or position that you cannot see truth when it stands before you. Beware the desire to preserve power at the expense of revelation, for what you protect in fear may become the very thing that blinds you to God's presence. The story of these leaders is not distant history. It is the story of the soul whenever it resists transformation, whenever it silences the voice within that calls for surrender. Jesus confronted them with a choice: to yield and be remade, or to resist and remain bound, and most chose to resist. Yet even their choice was woven into the larger tapestry, for their rejection did not destroy his mission, it fulfilled it. This is the paradox of divine design, that human fear and hatred are turned into channels for redemption, that what men intend for preservation, God uses for salvation, and in this pattern we see the depth of the mystery, that nothing, not even rejection of the Messiah, can prevent the unfolding of the kingdom of God. Not all of Israel turned away, for within the same nation that shouted, "Crucify him," there were souls who left everything to follow. And as I look into the records of spirit, I see a division as sharp as a blade cutting through the heart of a people. Some clung to tradition and feared disruption, while others saw in his words the fulfillment of ancient promises. Fishermen laid down their nets, tax collectors abandoned their wealth, zealots surrendered their weapons, women who had been cast aside found dignity at his side. The poor and broken discovered that God had not forgotten them, and in their faith the seed of a new covenant was planted. Yet even as they followed with conviction, the larger body of Israel resisted. And this resistance was not merely stubbornness, but the collision of identity with revelation. For the Messiah came not only to comfort, but to divide, to separate those willing to be remade from those unwilling to let go. And thus the rejection became a schism within Israel itself. I know that truth, when it arrives, always divides before it unites, for it exposes the hidden loyalties of the heart. And so it was with Jesus, who forced every soul to choose between the safety of the familiar and the risk of the unknown. Those who embraced him found in his presence not just teaching, but life. They felt seen by God in a way the temple rituals had never given. They discovered direct communion without the mediation of priest or sacrifice, and this was both liberation and scandal. For to accept such intimacy was to declare that the entire system could no longer hold the weight of divine presence. The leaders feared this most, for if the people discovered that God was accessible in the carpenter from Nazareth, their control would dissolve, and so they hardened their rejection. But the simple, the outcast, the weary, they opened their hearts and received, and through them the message spread beyond boundaries, until what began as a movement within Israel became the light for nations. In the soul records, I see how division is never the final word. It is the fire through which a greater unity is forged. And though many in Israel rejected him, their rejection was the very soil in which Gentile faith took root. And yet the covenant with Israel was not dissolved. For Paul later revealed the mystery that their stumbling was partial, their hardening temporary, and that one day all Israel would awaken to the truth they once resisted. This division, therefore, was not failure but stage, a step in the unfolding pattern of redemption. Consider the disciples themselves. Jews who followed Jesus with trembling yet with faith. They witnessed his miracles, they heard his parables, they saw the empty tomb, and from their testimony the church was born, not as a Gentile invention, but as the flowering of Jewish faith transformed. And yet this very flowering widened the schism, for as Gentiles entered in greater numbers, the gap between synagogue and church grew until the two paths became distinct. In this I perceive the hand of divine design, for the separation allowed the message to spread unhindered by the weight of tradition. Yet the root in Israel remained, never severed but hidden, awaiting its season of renewal. Those who rejected him believed they were preserving holiness, yet in truth they were resisting transformation, while those who embraced him seemed traitors to their nation, yet in truth they were pioneers of a kingdom that would embrace all nations. And in this paradox lies the mystery of God's wisdom, that rejection and acceptance together formed the channel through which salvation entered the world. I tell you plainly that the rejection of Jesus cannot be understood without also seeing the acceptance, for the story is not one of total blindness, but of division, and it is this division that explains why some hearts were opened while others closed, why the poor rejoiced while the powerful trembled, why some saw the Son of God and others only a threat. The lesson for every soul is clear. You too must choose when truth confronts you. You must decide whether to cling to the safety of tradition or to step into the risk of revelation, and know that the choice is never neutral, for to remain unmoved is itself to reject, while to receive is to be remade. The first century was torn by this decision, but through it the kingdom spread. And even now the same kingdom calls each soul to decide, for the Messiah always comes in forms unexpected, and the heart must always discern whether to cling or to surrender. This is the division that births salvation, the tension that reveals who you truly are. And though it may wound for a season, it leads to healing for eternity. The interpretations of prophecy became the battleground where faith divided, for Scripture held within it two streams of vision, one pointing to a suffering servant and another to a conquering king. And as I search the records of spirit, I see how the Jewish people chose one stream and set aside the other, shaping their expectation of Messiah into a ruler of flesh and blood who would restore Israel's throne, yet overlooking the deeper truth that redemption would come through sacrifice, not conquest. Isaiah spoke of the servant who would bear the iniquities of many. Christians saw Jesus in this, yet Jewish scholars saw in the servant the nation itself, a people carrying the weight of exile and oppression, a people destined to be vindicated by God's justice. And so what Christians read as personal prophecy was to them a collective symbol. Daniel spoke of an anointed one cut off. Christians discerned the crucifixion, while Jews placed it in another era, tied to desecration of the temple and political upheaval. Thus, the same words led to different conclusions because expectation bent the lens of interpretation. In the Shema, it is written, "The Lord is one," a truth sacred and unshakable. And so the claim of Jesus to share divine nature seemed impossible, for in their eyes to accept him as God incarnate was to betray the indivisible oneness of God. And this became a wall between faiths, one side proclaiming incarnation, the other safeguarding monotheism. Yet in the soul records I see these are not contradictions but complementary truths. For God is one, and yet this oneness is vast enough to enter into flesh without division, vast enough to speak as Father, Son, and Spirit while remaining undivided. But such a vision could not be received by a people whose entire identity had been forged in defending the oneness of God against idolatry. And so their resistance was the fruit of fidelity, even as it became blindness to revelation. Jesus also spoke of the law not as a burden but as fulfillment, saying he came not to abolish but to complete. Yet his emphasis on spirit rather than letter was perceived as violation, for to heal on the Sabbath, to touch the unclean, to eat with sinners, appeared to be dismantling the very framework that had preserved Israel's holiness for centuries. And so they judged him not faithful but dangerous. In truth, he was drawing the law to its deepest root, revealing that love of God and love of neighbor were the foundation upon which every commandment stood. But this simplicity was too radical for those who had built identity on layers of tradition, and so they rejected the one who fulfilled what they cherished. I know that prophecy always carries this danger, for it speaks in symbols that require the heart to discern. And when the heart is hardened by expectation, it sees only what it wants, dismissing the rest. And so prophecy, which was given to prepare, became instead a stumbling block. The suffering servant was not denied, but reinterpreted. The anointed cut off was not ignored, but relocated. The promise of a king was elevated above all others. And in this selective vision, the people prepared themselves to miss the fulfillment when it came. Yet this was not error alone. It was part of divine design. For the rejection created the opening for Gentiles to enter, and in time the blindness of one stream would be healed by the faith of another, until both were joined in one revelation. The lesson for the soul is clear. Do not cling so tightly to one image of prophecy that you cannot see when fulfillment comes in another form. Do not assume that God must act according to your reading of the text, for the Spirit speaks in layers, and each layer is revealed in its time. The Jews preserved the oneness of God and the sanctity of law. The Christians proclaimed the incarnation and the fulfillment of prophecy, and though these paths diverged, they are both held within the larger mystery of redemption. In my vision, I see that the suffering servant and the conquering king are not two messiahs, but two faces of one. First the lamb who is slain, then the lion who reigns. First the cross, then the crown, and this order cannot be reversed, for sacrifice precedes glory, and humility is the gateway to sovereignty. The rejection of this truth by many in Israel was not final, it was a stage, and in the fullness of time the two streams of prophecy will be reconciled, and the people who once defended God's oneness will see that the Messiah did not break it but revealed its depth, that the one they pierced was the same Lord they had always served, and that their faithfulness in guarding the covenant was not wasted but preserved the very foundation upon which the nations could be grafted in. This is the mystery of prophecy, that it divides before it unites, blinds before it reveals, and yet always moves toward fulfillment. And the soul that understands this will not stumble, but will wait in faith, knowing that the ways of God are higher than the interpretations of man. Paul once stood among the Pharisees as one of their fiercest defenders, yet in the records of spirit I see how his encounter with the risen Christ shattered his certainties and opened his vision to the mystery that rejection itself had been woven into the plan of God. For through Israel's stumbling, the door of faith was opened to the Gentiles. And this truth he carried like fire across nations, declaring that those once far from the covenant were now grafted into the olive tree of Israel, not replacing the root, but drawing life from it, not erasing the promise, but expanding it. And in this revelation, the paradox of rejection became the pathway to inclusion. Paul spoke of a partial hardening, not a final rejection, saying that Israel's blindness was temporary until the fullness of the Gentiles should come in, and then all Israel would be saved. And as I read this mystery in the soul records, I see that it is not a contradiction, but a rhythm, a pattern of expansion and return, a cycle where the promise flows outward to embrace the nations and then circles back to awaken the very people who first carried it. The image he gave was of branches, some broken off through unbelief, others grafted in through faith. And this image reveals the deep unity of the covenant. For though branches may differ, the root remains the same. The promises to Abraham and the faithfulness of God remain unshaken. And this shows that Gentiles do not stand alone, but live by the root of Israel. And Israel is not cast away, but waits for renewal. In the vision of spirit, I see how this mystery overturns human pride. For neither Jew nor Gentile may boast. The Jew cannot say the covenant belongs only to us. The Gentile cannot say we have replaced you, for both depend on mercy, both are sustained by the same root, and both are incomplete without the other. And this is the wisdom that Paul grasped in his soul when he said, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, for all are one in Christ Jesus." This grafting in of the Gentiles was not an afterthought. It was foreseen in the prophets. Isaiah spoke of a light to the nations, that salvation would reach to the ends of the earth. And Paul saw in this the confirmation that what appeared rejection was in truth expansion. For God's plan was never narrow but universal, never bound to one nation alone, but destined to embrace every tribe and tongue. Yet this inclusion did not mean that Israel's calling was void, for Paul declared that the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. And in this I see the eternal truth that God does not abandon what he has chosen, even when they turn away. His covenant remains. His promise endures, and his love waits like a flame, unextinguished, and in the appointed time it will burn again within the heart of Israel. The paradox is staggering, that the nation which resisted the Messiah became the very soil through which the gospel reached the world, and the nations that embraced the Messiah are destined to stir Israel to jealousy, provoking them to rediscover what they once refused. And in this strange exchange, the wisdom of God is revealed, a wisdom higher than human thought, a design that turns rejection into redemption and division into reconciliation. As I gaze deeper into the records, I see that this mystery speaks not only to nations, but to every soul. For within each person there are parts that resist and parts that receive, branches that are fruitful and branches that are barren. And God in mercy grafts in what is new, while pruning what is old, until the whole being is drawn into union. And so the story of Jew and Gentile is also the story of the human heart, learning that rejection is not the end, but the beginning of transformation. The Gentiles rejoiced in their inclusion, yet Paul warned them not to boast, reminding them that they stood only by faith and could also be cut off if they turned to pride. And this warning echoes through time, for the temptation of the soul is always to exalt itself, forgetting that mercy is the only root, and when mercy is forgotten, faith withers. Israel preserved the oneness of God through centuries of exile and trial, and Gentiles brought the message of Messiah to the ends of the earth, and both are held within the same design, waiting for the day when the two will be reconciled in one faith. In this vision I know that God wastes nothing. Even rejection becomes instrument, even blindness becomes preparation, and in the end all will be gathered. All will see that the one rejected was the cornerstone, the root that holds every branch. This is the mystery Paul carried with fire, that no soul and no nation is beyond redemption, that what is broken off can be grafted in again, and that the fullness of the kingdom requires both Jew and Gentile, not in rivalry but in unity. For only together is the covenant complete. The consequences of rejecting Jesus as Messiah reach beyond history into the eternal destiny of the soul. For in the records of spirit I see how every choice creates vibration, and the rejection of Christ created a rupture that still reverberates, not only in Israel but in every nation that hears his name and must decide. For Jesus declared, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And these words were not metaphor but revelation, a statement that union with God is not achieved through law or tradition alone, but through him who embodies the word itself. The early disciples understood this with unshakable certainty. Peter stood before the rulers and said, Salvation is found in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given to men by which we must be saved. And such a claim was offensive to those who believed the Torah was sufficient. Yet in truth it revealed that the law had always pointed forward to its fulfillment in the living Christ. Rejection, therefore, was not a neutral stance. It was a turning away from the path of reconciliation. And this turning carried consequence. For without recognition of the Messiah, the veil remained, and the heart could not see the fullness of God's plan. Paul wrote that rejection leads to spiritual blindness, to a darkening of understanding, for when the light is refused, the eyes accustom themselves to shadow. And this too I have seen in the records, that when the soul resists truth, it creates a hardness within a stone where there was once flesh. And yet even this hardness is not without purpose, for God uses it as a stage of preparation, waiting for the time when the stone will be broken and the heart softened again. For Gentiles, the acceptance of Jesus opened access to covenantal blessing, to communion with God beyond temple ritual, to grace that transformed life from within. And yet for Israel, the rejection became both judgment and mercy. Judgment in that blindness endured, mercy in that the covenant was not revoked. For Paul declared that the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. In this paradox lies the mystery of hope, that even in rejection the love of God continues, waiting for the day when the veil will lift and recognition will dawn. But let me speak also of the personal consequence, for each soul that turns away from Christ misses not merely doctrine but living union, misses the peace that comes when sins are forgiven, misses the healing of the heart that only grace can bring, and instead remains bound and striving, trying to prove worth through law or merit, never tasting the freedom that comes with surrender. Rejection of Jesus is rejection of the inner transformation he offers, and the soul that refuses this path remains restless, burdened, unable to enter into the rest of God. Yet hope remains, for God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. And so the invitation stands open, even to those who once turned away, and the history of Israel testifies that what was rejected at first may yet be embraced in the end. This is why Paul spoke with such urgency, saying that if their rejection meant reconciliation for the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? And in this statement lies the prophecy of a future awakening, when Israel will see the one they pierced and recognize in him the fulfillment of every promise. And when that day comes, the division between Jew and Gentile will dissolve, for both will stand together in one covenant of grace. Until then, the consequence of rejection is a lesson for all humanity, a mirror showing how expectation blinds, how fear resists, how pride hardens, and the invitation of Christ remains the dividing line, the choice that defines destiny. I tell you plainly that rejection of Jesus is not merely about theology, It is about whether the soul chooses life or remains in shadow, whether it opens to the Spirit or closes upon itself, and this decision echoes into eternity, shaping both the journey of nations and the journey of individuals. Yet even here mercy reigns, for God bends rejection into redemption, using the refusal of some to bring inclusion for others, turning blindness into preparation for sight. And so the story is not finished. The consequences, though real, are not final, for grace continues to pursue. And the day will come when the rejection will give way to recognition, when what was cast aside will be embraced, and when the Messiah once denied will be acknowledged as Lord by every tongue. This is the mystery I see in the soul records, that even the most painful turning away is gathered into the larger tapestry of God's design, until all find their place in the kingdom that cannot be shaken. I have walked through the records of spirit and seen how the story of Israel and Jesus is not simply history but mirror, a reflection of the human soul in its struggle to recognize truth when it arrives in unexpected form. And as this journey draws to its close, I feel the weight of what has been revealed, the paradox of rejection that opened the path of redemption, the blindness that became gateway for sight, the division that prepared the ground for unity. And in this tapestry I hear the quiet voice of God whispering that nothing is wasted, no refusal is beyond his reach, no darkness is beyond his light. The chosen people who longed for deliverance were unable to receive the Messiah because their image of salvation had hardened, and yet that very refusal became the door through which Gentiles entered, proving that God weaves even resistance into his plan. And as I contemplate this mystery, I see that the story is not finished, for Paul's vision of Israel's awakening still waits to be fulfilled, and one day the branches broken will be grafted in again, and the covenant will shine in fullness. This truth lingers in my heart like a melody, reminding me that rejection is not final, that blindness is never the last word, that the soul which stumbles may rise again, and that the plan of God moves through both failure and faith until all are gathered in one. In my readings, I have often seen how individuals resist their own healing, clinging to pain because it is familiar, turning away from light because it demands surrender, and the story of Israel reflects this same pattern, for the human soul fears what will undo it, even when what undoes it is the very thing that saves. Yet God in mercy allows this fear, turns it into preparation, and waits until the soul is ready to open, for divine patience is longer than human resistance. The Messiah who came in humility still comes to every heart in forms unrecognized, and the question for each of us is whether we will cling to expectation or embrace revelation, whether we will demand a God who conforms to our desires or surrender to a God who transforms them, and in this choice lies destiny. As I rest in the flow of spirit, I see that the final reconciliation is not only for Jew and Gentile, but for every soul. For within each person there are parts that resist and parts that receive, branches that remain barren and branches that bear fruit, and God tends them all with patient hands, pruning, grafting, healing, until the whole tree is restored. And so the story of nations is also the story of you, of me, of all who must choose whether to turn away or to believe. The end is not destruction, but union, for God's purpose is always life. And though the path winds through rejection and suffering, it leads at last to recognition and joy. When the veil lifts and the Messiah once denied is embraced, when what was hidden is revealed and what was divided is made whole, I hear in the silence of spirit the promise spoken long ago, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. And I know this promise is for Israel, for the nations, for every seeker. For you who wonder if the rejection of the past has cancelled your future, I tell you it has not. For the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, and his mercy endures beyond every refusal. The consequence of turning away is real. It is blindness, restlessness, distance from the peace that comes only in union with Christ. But the mercy that waits is greater still, a mercy that bends even rejection into redemption, that turns stumbling into invitation, that transforms darkness into dawn, and in this mercy the soul may find rest. As I bring these reflections to their close, I feel not an ending but an opening, as if the story continues beyond words, flowing into your own life, into your own choices, and I ask you to see yourself within it, to ask whether you are clinging to images that blind you, or whether you are willing to recognize truth even when it comes in humble form. The rejection of Jesus by many of his own is not merely their story, it is the story of all humanity, and in its mirror we are invited to awaken, to lay down pride and fear, to open the heart to grace, and to discover that the one once refused still waits at the door, still calls by name, still offers the kingdom that is within. And so I leave you with this lingering truth, that the Messiah rejected has become the cornerstone, that the blindness of one age becomes the vision of another, that rejection is never the end but the turning of the page, and that the final chapter of the soul is not exile but homecoming, not division but reconciliation, not despair but glory. For in the design of God, every refusal is answered by a deeper mercy, every wound by a greater healing, and every ending by a beginning that cannot be broken.